Henry sat in the living room, his face illuminated by the soft glow of the television. The news droned on in the background, the anchor discussing the latest policies and decisions out of Washington. Henry barely listened. His mind was elsewhere, trapped in a cycle of grief and denial. The room was steeped in shadows, the curtains drawn tightly against the world outside. On the mantel above the fireplace sat a framed photograph of Caleb, his bright smile frozen in time. Henry's gaze kept drifting to it, his chest tightening with each glance. It had been 2 weeks since Caleb's death, and the house still felt hollow, an echo of the life it once held. Caleb had been only 17, full of ambition and energy, but also opinionated, too much so, Henry often thought. They had clashed over everything, especially in the last few years. Henry had always believed in order, tradition, and loyalty to leaders who could get things done. Caleb, however, had been fiercely critical, his youthful idealism clashing with Henry's steadfast views. Their last argument had been especially heated, with Caleb storming out, leaving behind a trail of angry words that now haunted Henry every waking moment. A loud creak startled him, pulling him from his thoughts. The sound came from the stairs, where the wood groaned as if under the weight of something heavy. Henry frowned, his brow furrowing. The house had always been noisy, but this sound felt different. He turned off the TV, plunging the room into silence, save for the faint hum of the refrigerator in the kitchen. Just the house settling, he muttered under his breath, though his voice lacked conviction. The photograph of Caleb caught his eye again, and Henry sighed, running a hand over his face. He hadn't gone into Caleb's room since the funeral. The door remained closed at the end of the hallway, a silent reminder of what he had lost. Part of him wanted to open it, to step inside and breathe in the remnants of his son's life, but he couldn't bring himself to do it. He reached for his glass of bourbon on the side table, taking a long sip as the creaking sound came again, this time louder. It was followed by the faint sound of footsteps, slow, deliberate, and impossibly out of place in the otherwise empty house. Henry froze, the glass hovering midair. His heart began to pound, the sound thudding in his ears. "Is someone there?" he called out, his voice steady but tinged with unease. The footsteps stopped. The silence that followed was heavier than before, oppressive in its stillness. Henry set the glass down carefully, his hand trembling. He stood, his muscles tense, and moved toward the stairs. As he approached, the air seemed to grow colder, a chill settling over the room that made the hairs on the back of his neck stand up. He reached the base of the stairs, peering upward into the darkness. The hallway above was shrouded in shadows, the dim light from the living room failing to reach beyond the first few steps. "Hello," he called again, his voice louder this time. For a moment, there was nothing. Then, from the top of the stairs, a voice answered. It was soft, barely more than a whisper, but unmistakable. "Dad?" Henry's breath caught in his throat. The voice was Caleb's. He gripped the banister tightly, his knuckles turning white. "Caleb," he whispered, his voice trembling. Is that you?" The shadows at the top of the stairs shifted, and a figure stepped into view. It was Caleb, or at least it looked like him. He stood there, his face pale and expressionless, his eyes dark and unreadable. He was dressed in the same clothes Henry had last seen him in, a faded hoodie and jeans, but something about him was off. His presence felt heavy, unnatural, as though the air around him was bending under its weight. Henry staggered back a step, his mind struggling to process what he was seeing. "This isn't real," he said to himself, shaking his head. "It's not possible." But Caleb didn't move. He stood silently, his gaze fixed on Henry with an intensity that made his skin crawl. The room seemed to grow colder still, the shadows deepening as an unnatural silence fell over the house. "You're not real," Henry said again, his voice breaking. "You can't be." Caleb tilted his head slightly, his expression unreadable. "I came back," he said, his voice low and distant. "I had to." Henry's heart pounded in his chest, his mind racing. This had to be a dream or a trick of his grief-addled mind. There was no other explanation. But Caleb's presence felt too real, too solid to be an illusion. "Why?" Henry asked, his voice barely more than a whisper. "Why would you come back?" Caleb stepped down the first few stairs, his movements slow and deliberate. The air grew heavier with each step, pressing down on Henry like an invisible weight. "I saw things," Caleb said, his voice steady but unnervingly detached. "Things I wasn't supposed to see. Things you need to know." Henry shook his head, backing away from the stairs. "This isn't happening," he muttered. "This can't be happening." Caleb stopped, his gaze piercing. "You have to listen, Dad," he said. "You have to know what's coming." "What's coming?" Henry asked, his voice rising with a mix of fear and anger. "What are you talking about?" But Caleb didn't answer. He simply stared at Henry, his dark eyes unblinking, as the shadows around him seemed to pulse and shift. The temperature in the room plummeted further, and Henry felt a shiver run down his spine. "You don't understand," Caleb said finally, his voice so soft it was almost drowned out by the pounding of Henry's heart. "But you will." Henry opened his mouth to respond, but no words came out. His mind was reeling, his body frozen in place as he stared at the figure that shouldn't exist. Caleb's expression didn't change, but his presence filled the room, suffocating and undeniable. The silence stretched on, heavy and oppressive, until Henry couldn't bear it anymore. "What do you want from me?" he demanded, his voice breaking. Caleb's gaze darkened, and for the first time, Henry saw a flicker of something in his eyes, something cold and unforgiving. "The truth," Caleb said simply. "It's time you face it." Henry stood frozen at the base of the stairs, his mind racing as he stared at the boy who shouldn't have been there. Caleb, if it was really Caleb, remained at the top of the staircase, his pale face unreadable, his presence filling the house with an unnatural weight. The words, "It's time you face it," echoed in Henry's mind, sending a chill down his spine. He opened his mouth to speak but found his throat dry, his voice caught somewhere between disbelief and fear. "Face what?" he finally managed, his words barely more than a whisper. Caleb's expression remained still, but his eyes seemed darker now, the faint light from the living room catching the sharp edges of his features. "The truth," he said again, his voice low and almost mechanical. "Everything you've ignored. Everything you've let happen." Henry felt his chest tighten, his breath quickening as his mind scrambled for answers. "This isn't real," he muttered, more to himself than to the figure before him. "You're not real." The lights in the house flickered suddenly, casting long, distorted shadows across the walls. The air grew colder still, the temperature dropping so sharply that Henry could see his breath. Caleb took another step down, the creak of the wooden stair breaking the oppressive silence. "I didn't ask to come back," Caleb said, his tone calm but carrying an eerie edge. "But they sent me. They made me see things I can't unsee. And now I'm here because you need to know." Henry shook his head, his disbelief morphing into frustration. "Stop it," he snapped, his voice rising. "This is some kind of sick joke. I don't know who you are, but you're not my son." Caleb stopped mid-step, his head tilting slightly as if considering Henry's words. "You think this is a joke?" he asked softly, his voice carrying a weight that made Henry flinch. "Do you think what's coming is a joke?" Henry's heart pounded in his chest. He didn't want to ask, didn't want to give this thing any more power over him, but the words slipped out before he could stop them. "What's coming?" The flickering lights dimmed further, plunging the house into a suffocating half-darkness. Caleb descended another step, his movements deliberate and measured. "I saw it," he said, his tone flat but chilling. "I saw the world burning. I saw families torn apart. I saw greed and hate consuming everything until there was nothing left." Henry's stomach churned, his knees threatening to give out beneath him. "You're lying," he said weakly, though even as the words left his mouth, he knew they rang hollow. Caleb's eyes narrowed slightly, a flicker of something cold and ancient crossing his face. "Do I look like I'm lying?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper but sharp enough to cut through the heavy silence. Henry's gaze flicked to the photo on the mantel, the smiling boy who had been full of life, full of fire. The boy in front of him now was a stranger, a specter wearing his son's face but carrying something far darker within. "You're trying to scare me," Henry said, his voice trembling. "Well, it's not going to work." Caleb tilted his head again, his expression unchanging. "You should be scared," he said simply. Because what's coming, you helped make it happen. The accusation hit Henry like a physical blow, and he staggered back, his hands gripping the edge of the banister for support. I don't know what you're talking about, he said, his voice defensive. I've done nothing wrong. Caleb's lips twitched into a faint, humorless smile. Haven't you? He asked. Do you remember the choices you made? The leaders you supported? The voices you silenced because they didn't fit your version of the truth? Henry's mind reeled, the weight of the words pressing down on him. This is insane, he muttered. You're not making any sense. Caleb stepped off the last stair, his figure now fully visible in the dim light of the living room. He looked the same as Henry remembered, but there was something off about him. Something in the way he moved, the way he stood, as though he were both there and not there at the same time. They showed me, Caleb said, his voice quiet but unrelenting. They showed me how it all falls apart. And you're part of it? Henry's temper flared, his fear twisting into anger. I've done nothing but work hard and follow the rules, he snapped. I've done what I was supposed to do. I've supported the people who are trying to make this country strong again. Strong for who? Caleb asked, his voice cutting through Henry's rant like a knife. For the people at the top? For the ones who profit while everyone else suffers? Henry opened his mouth to respond, but the words died in his throat. The lights flickered again, and a deep, unnatural hum filled the air, resonating through the walls and floor like a heartbeat. Caleb stepped closer, his gaze locking onto Henry's with an intensity that made him feel exposed, vulnerable. You think you're innocent, Caleb said, his voice low and steady. But your choices have consequences. You've ignored the suffering, turned a blind eye to the warnings, all because it was easier than facing the truth. Henry's hands clenched into fists, his frustration boiling over. You're just a kid, he spat. You don't understand how the world works? Caleb's expression didn't change, but his eyes seemed to darken further, the shadows around him shifting ominously. And you think you do? He asked softly. You think the world works because of people like you, people who sit back and let others pay the price for your comfort? The hum grew louder, the air vibrating with an unnatural energy. Henry's heart raced as he tried to process what was happening, but every rational thought was drowned out by the overwhelming presence of the boy who shouldn't have been there. Caleb's gaze bore into him, unblinking and relentless. They sent me back, he said. Not to punish you, but to warn you. You still have a choice, Dad. But the clock is ticking. Henry opened his mouth to respond, but before he could speak, the lights went out completely, plunging the house into darkness. The hum stopped abruptly, leaving an oppressive silence in its wake. And in the silence, Caleb's voice came again, soft and haunting. You're running out of time. The darkness in the house felt alive, pressing against Henry from every angle. He stood frozen, his breath shallow, his fists clenched as Caleb's final words echoed in his ears, "You're running out of time." The oppressive silence was broken only by the faint creaks of the house settling, though they now seemed unnervingly deliberate. "Caleb?" Henry called out, his voice trembling despite his effort to steady it. "Where are you?" No answer. The shadows seemed thicker now, shifting and curling at the edges of his vision. The chill in the air seeped into his bones, and he found himself struggling to move, as though the weight of the dark was holding him in place. "Enough," he barked, his frustration boiling over into anger. "If this is some kind of sick trick, I'm not playing along anymore." A faint laugh echoed from somewhere behind him, soft, hollow, and chillingly familiar. Henry spun around, his heart pounding in his chest. Caleb stood in the corner of the living room now, his figure barely visible in the dim light filtering in from the street lamp outside. His head was tilted slightly, his expression unreadable. "This isn't a trick," Caleb said, his voice low and steady. "This is your reckoning." Henry's knees threatened to give out beneath him. The word reckoning hung in the air like a sentence, heavy and final. "Why are you doing this?" he demanded, his voice cracking. "Why are you blaming me for things I had no control over?" Caleb's gaze darkened, and the faint light seemed to twist around him, casting strange shadows across the walls. "You had control," he said. "You just chose to ignore it." Henry shook his head, his frustration mounting. "I did what I thought was right," he said, his voice rising. I supported strong leadership, people who could fix the mess this country was in. Strong for who? Caleb shot back, his voice cutting through the air like a knife. You think strength is measured by power? By money? By who can shout the loudest? The world I saw isn't strong, Dad. It's broken. And people like you are the ones breaking it. Henry took a step back, the weight of Caleb's words sinking in despite his growing denial. I'm just one person, he said weakly. What difference could I have made? Caleb stepped closer, his movements unnaturally fluid, like a shadow gliding across the floor. Every choice you made had a ripple, he said. Every time you turned a blind eye, every time you defended the wrong side, you added to the storm. Henry's stomach churned as memories flashed through his mind, arguments with Caleb, dismissing his concerns as naive, praising policies that Caleb had tried to warn him about. He had always thought he was doing what was best, but now, faced with the specter of his son, he wasn't so sure. You don't understand, Henry said, his voice trembling. It's not that simple. Caleb's expression hardened. It is that simple, he said. You just don't want to admit it. The air in the room seemed to vibrate, a low, almost imperceptible hum building in the background. The shadows on the walls twisted and writhed, taking on shapes that made Henry's skin crawl. He tried to focus, to make sense of what was happening, but every rational thought was drowned out by the growing sense of dread. What did you see? Henry asked finally, his voice barely above a whisper. What did you see in heaven? Caleb's eyes locked onto his, unblinking and piercing. I saw the truth, he said. I saw how it all ends. Henry's breath caught in his throat. Ends? He repeated, his voice cracking. What do you mean? Caleb didn't answer right away. Instead, he turned slightly, his gaze drifting to the photograph on the mantel. They showed me everything, he said, his voice distant. The greed, the hatred, the divisions that tear people apart, and the ones who profit from it all, standing at the top, watching it burn. Henry's hands clenched into fists. You're talking about politics, he said. About people like Trump. Is that it? Caleb's head tilted slightly, and for the first time, a flicker of something like anger crossed his face. It's not just him, he said. But he's part of it. And so are you. Henry staggered back, the accusation hitting him like a blow to the chest. That's not fair, he said, his voice rising. I didn't do anything wrong. Didn't you? Caleb asked, his tone cold. You cheered for him. You defended him. You ignored the suffering of people who didn't fit your idea of what was right. You let it happen. The lights flickered again, and the low hum grew louder, reverberating through the room. Henry's heart raced as he tried to process Caleb's words, but the weight of them was too much. He felt like he was drowning, the air thick and suffocating. What do you want me to do? Henry asked, his voice breaking. I can't change the past. Caleb's gaze bore into him, unblinking and relentless. No, he said, but you can change what comes next. If you don't, there won't be anything left to save. Henry's mind reeled, the room spinning around him as Caleb's words sank in. The shadows on the wall seemed to close in, the darkness pressing against him from every side. He couldn't tell if it was real or if his mind was finally breaking under the weight of his grief and guilt. You still have time, Caleb said softly, his voice almost drowned out by the hum. But not much. The lights dimmed further, the room plunging into near total darkness. Caleb's figure seemed to blur, the edges of his form dissolving into the shadows. Henry reached out instinctively, his hand trembling. Caleb, he called, his voice cracking. Don't leave me. But the shadows swallowed Caleb whole, leaving Henry standing alone in the dark, the hum fading into an oppressive silence. The weight of the encounter pressed down on him, and for the first time, he felt the full magnitude of his choices, his failures, and the looming consequences he could no longer ignore. The silence that followed Caleb's disappearance was deafening. Henry stood in the middle of the room, his breaths shallow and rapid as he scanned the darkened space around him. His mind reeled, every rational thought colliding with the impossible reality of what he had just experienced. Caleb, he whispered, his voice barely audible. The weight of the encounter pressed down on him like an invisible force, leaving him rooted in place. He tried to convince himself that it wasn't real, that grief had twisted his mind into seeing things that weren't there. But the cold, the flickering lights, the shadows that seemed alive, it had all felt far too real. The photograph on the mantel caught his eye, its frame gleaming faintly in the dim light. He stared at Caleb's smiling face, his chest tightening as he remembered the arguments, the sharp words exchanged, the divide that had grown between them over the years. Caleb had always been so passionate, so driven, while Henry had clung to his ideals, unwilling to bend. Now, standing in the suffocating darkness of his home, Henry couldn't shake the feeling that Caleb had been right all along. The floorboards creaked behind him, the sound sharp and sudden in the oppressive silence. Henry spun around, his heart leaping into his throat. "Who's there?" he demanded, his voice trembling but loud. The shadows at the far end of the room shifted, twisting unnaturally before settling into stillness. Henry squinted, his pulse pounding in his ears. He felt a cold sweat break out across his forehead as he took a hesitant step forward. "Caleb," he called out, his voice wavering. "Is that you?" No response. The temperature in the room dropped sharply, and Henry's breath puffed out in visible clouds. His hands trembled as he clenched them into fists, his nerves frayed to their breaking point. The air felt heavy, suffused with a presence he couldn't see but could feel pressing against him from all sides. "I'm not afraid of you," Henry said, though the quaver in his voice betrayed his words. "If you're here, show yourself." The lights flickered again, and for a brief moment, the room was illuminated in a harsh, stuttering glow. In that instant, Henry saw Caleb standing in the corner, his head tilted slightly, his expression as blank and unreadable as before. But just as quickly as the light came, it vanished, plunging the room back into darkness. Henry stumbled backward, his heart hammering in his chest. "What do you want from me?" he shouted, his voice cracking. "Why are you doing this?" Caleb's voice echoed softly from the shadows, chilling in its calmness. "I'm not doing anything," he said. "This is your doing." Henry's breath caught in his throat. "What does that mean?" he demanded, his fear mingling with frustration. "I didn't ask for any of this." "You didn't have to," Caleb replied, his voice seeming to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. "Your choices brought you here. Your choices brought me back." The weight of Caleb's words settled heavily on Henry's shoulders, and he felt his legs threaten to give out beneath him. "This isn't fair," he said weakly. "I didn't know." "You didn't want to know," Caleb interrupted, his tone sharp. "You turned a blind eye because it was easier. Because facing the truth would have forced you to change." Henry's anger flared, cutting through his fear. "I did what I thought was right," he shouted. "I followed strong leaders, supported people who wanted to fix this country." Caleb's laugh echoed through the room, cold and hollow. "Strong leaders?" he repeated. "Like Trump?" The mention of the name sent a jolt through Henry. "He's done more for this country than anyone else," he retorted, though his voice lacked the conviction it once had. "He stood up for what was right?" "For who?" Caleb shot back, his voice rising. "For the powerful? For the ones who profit while everyone else suffers? You call that strength?" Henry clenched his fists, his frustration boiling over. "You don't understand how the world works," he said, his voice trembling. "You're just a kid." Caleb's figure appeared again, stepping forward from the shadows with an eerie fluidity. His face was pale, his eyes dark and unblinking as they bore into Henry's. "I'm not a kid anymore," he said softly. "I've seen what comes next." The room grew colder still, the air heavy with an unnatural pressure. Henry's breath came in short gasps as he stared at the boy who was and wasn't his son. "What do you mean?" he whispered. "What did you see?" Caleb stopped a few feet away from him, his expression as blank as ever. "I saw the truth," he said. "I saw what happens when people like you refuse to change. When leaders like Trump exploit division and greed for their own gain. I saw the end." Henry shook his head, his fear rising again. "You're lying," he said, though the words felt hollow. "You're trying to scare me." Caleb's gaze didn't waver. "You should be scared," he said. "Because it's already happening. You just don't see it yet." The lights flickered once more, casting grotesque, twisting shadows across the walls. Henry stumbled back, his pulse pounding in his ears as the room seemed to close in around him. Caleb's figure loomed in the flickering light, his presence more imposing than ever. "You still have time," Caleb said, his voice soft but insistent. "But not much. The clock is ticking, and every second you waste brings us closer to the end." Henry's knees buckled, and he sank to the floor, his hands gripping the edge of the coffee table for support. His mind raced, desperate to make sense of what was happening, but every thought was drowned out by the weight of Caleb's words. "What do I do?" he whispered, his voice cracking. "How do I stop it?" The lights flickered again, and Caleb's figure blurred, dissolving into the shadows as the room fell silent once more. Henry was left alone in the oppressive darkness, his chest heaving as the gravity of the situation settled over him. The hum returned, faint and distant, as Caleb's voice echoed one last time. "Choose wisely, Dad. Time's almost up." Henry sat on the cold floor of the living room, his back pressed against the edge of the coffee table as Caleb's voice faded into silence. The weight of his words lingered in the air. "Choose wisely, Dad. Time's almost up." They hung over Henry like an invisible noose, tightening with every passing second. His breathing was shallow, his hands trembling as he clutched at his knees. The room felt suffocatingly still, the hum in the background growing fainter but no less oppressive. The photograph of Caleb on the mantel seemed to mock him now, a reminder of the boy he had lost, and the ghost who had returned to deliver a message too horrifying to fully comprehend. "I'm losing my mind," Henry muttered under his breath, his voice cracking. "This can't be real. It can't be." But deep down he knew it was. The cold air that bit at his skin, the flickering lights, the shadows that had moved with a life of their own. He couldn't explain them away as grief or stress. And Caleb, the way he had spoken, the things he had said, they carried a weight that couldn't be ignored. He pushed himself to his feet, his legs unsteady beneath him. The silence in the house was deafening, broken only by the faint creak of the floorboards as he moved. He glanced around, half expecting Caleb to reappear, but the room remained empty. Henry's gaze fell on the TV remote lying on the couch. He grabbed it with shaking hands and turned on the television, desperate for some semblance of normalcy. The screen flickered to life, but instead of the usual news channel, static filled the screen, the distorted image crackling ominously. "Damn thing," Henry muttered, jabbing at the buttons. But the static didn't clear. Instead, it seemed to shift, forming faint shapes that sent a chill down his spine. He squinted at the screen, his heart racing as the shapes coalesced into something recognizable. A face. Caleb's face. Henry stumbled back, his breath catching in his throat. The image on the screen was faint and distorted, but there was no mistaking it. Caleb's eyes stared out at him, dark and unblinking, as the static hissed softly in the background. "Dad," the voice crackled through the speakers, low and distorted. "You're not listening." Henry's stomach churned, his knees threatening to give out beneath him. "What do you want from me?" he shouted, his voice shaking. "Why are you doing this?" The image on the screen flickered, Caleb's face shifting slightly. "It's not about what I want," he said. "It's about what you need to do." Henry clenched his fists, his frustration boiling over. "I don't know what you're talking about," he snapped. "You're blaming me for things I can't control." The static on the screen grew louder, the hissing sound grating against his ears. "You've always had control," Caleb said, his voice cutting through the noise. "You just chose to ignore it." Henry's chest tightened as the words sank in. Memories flooded his mind. Conversations with Caleb, arguments about politics and morality, his own unwavering support for leaders and policies Caleb had vehemently opposed. He had always believed he was doing the right thing, that his choices were justified. But now, faced with Caleb's haunting presence, he wasn't so sure. "What do you want me to do?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. The static on the screen intensified, the distorted image of Caleb's face seeming to shift closer. "Open your eyes," Caleb said. "See the world for what it really is. Not for what you want it to be." Henry shook his head, his hands gripping the edge of the couch for support. "It's not that simple," he said weakly. "I can't change the past. But you can change the future," Caleb said. "If you don't, there won't be one." The lights in the room flickered violently, the shadows on the walls twisting and writhing like living things. The hum returned, louder this time, resonating through the house and making Henry's teeth chatter. He stumbled back, his mind reeling as the weight of Caleb's words pressed down on him. "What future?" Henry shouted, his voice cracking. "What's going to happen?" The static on the screen shifted again, and for a brief moment, Henry saw something that made his blood run cold. Flames. Cities crumbling. People screaming and running as the world around them burned. And through it all, a single figure stood tall, his face obscured but unmistakable. Trump. Henry's breath caught in his throat as the image disappeared, replaced once more by Caleb's face. "This isn't real," he said weakly, shaking his head. "It can't be real." "It's real," Caleb said. "And it's coming. Unless you stop it." Henry felt his legs give out, and he sank to the floor, his hands trembling as he stared at the flickering screen. "How?" he whispered. "How am I supposed to stop it?" Caleb's expression darkened, his gaze piercing through the static. "You know how," he said. "You've always known." The static grew louder, the screen flickering violently before going black. The hum in the room ceased, leaving Henry in deafening silence once more. He sat there, his mind racing, his chest heaving as the weight of Caleb's warning settled over him. The shadows on the wall seemed to shift again, curling and twisting in the corners of his vision. Henry closed his eyes, his hands gripping his knees as he tried to steady his breathing. "You've always known," Caleb's voice echoed in his mind. Henry opened his eyes, his gaze falling on the photograph on the mantel. Caleb's smile, frozen in time, seemed to mock him now. He had always prided himself on his convictions, on his loyalty to what he believed was right. But now, those convictions felt like chains, binding him to a path he wasn't sure he could escape. "I have to fix this," he whispered to himself, his voice trembling. "I have to fix it before it's too late." But even as the words left his mouth, he couldn't shake the feeling that it already was. The house was quiet now, a suffocating silence broken only by the faint ticking of the clock on the mantel. Henry remained on the floor, staring blankly at the dark television screen. Caleb's final words echoed in his mind, "You've always known." He didn't know how long he had been sitting there, but the darkness in the room felt heavier, the air colder. The oppressive atmosphere pressed down on him, making it hard to think, hard to breathe. The photograph of Caleb on the mantel seemed to glow faintly in the dim light, his frozen smile a cruel reminder of the son Henry had lost, and the one who had returned with a horrifying message. Henry's thoughts churned, his mind a storm of memories and regrets. He thought about every choice he had made, every argument with Caleb, every time he had dismissed his son's concerns as youthful naivety. He had always believed he was doing the right thing, that his loyalty to strong leadership was justified. But now, Caleb's words haunted him, unraveling everything he thought he knew. The silence was broken by a faint creak, the sound of footsteps on the stairs. Henry's breath caught in his throat as he turned toward the sound, his heart pounding. He braced himself for Caleb's return, for more accusations, more revelations that would tear at the fragile fabric of his reality. But no one appeared. The footsteps grew louder, each one deliberate, echoing through the stillness of the house. Henry scrambled to his feet, his pulse racing as he backed away from the staircase. "Caleb," he called out, his voice trembling. There was no response. The shadows at the top of the stairs shifted, twisting unnaturally before settling back into stillness. Henry's chest tightened as the temperature in the room dropped even further, the cold biting at his skin. He clenched his fists, trying to summon the courage to move, to confront whatever was coming. The footsteps stopped, and for a moment, the house was deathly silent. Then a voice, low, cold, and unmistakably Caleb's, echoed from the top of the stairs. "You're running out of time." Henry stumbled backward, his breath coming in shallow gasps. The voice was everywhere and nowhere, surrounding him, suffocating him. He felt his knees buckle, and he clutched the edge of the coffee table for support. "What do you want from me?" he shouted, his voice breaking. "I don't know what you want me to do." The shadows on the walls twisted again, curling and writhing like living things. The faint hum returned, a low vibration that resonated through the house, growing louder with each passing second. "You've always known," Caleb's voice repeated, colder this time, sharper. "You just didn't want to see." The lights flickered violently, and the room seemed to tilt, the walls closing in around Henry. He clutched his head, his mind reeling as Caleb's words hammered against his consciousness. "I didn't know," he shouted, his voice raw with desperation. "I didn't know it would be like this." The hum reached a deafening pitch, and the shadows converged, forming a dark, swirling mass at the center of the room. Henry stared in horror as the mass began to take shape, solidifying into a figure that was both familiar and terrifying. It was Caleb, but not the boy Henry remembered. His face was pale, his eyes dark and hollow, and his presence radiated an otherworldly energy that made Henry's skin crawl. He stepped forward, his movements slow and deliberate, the floor creaking beneath his feet. "You didn't want to know," Caleb said, his voice low and unrelenting. "You chose ignorance because it was easier. But ignorance doesn't absolve you, Dad. It condemns you." Henry's knees gave out, and he sank to the floor, his hands trembling. "I thought I was doing the right thing," he whispered, his voice cracking. "I thought I was protecting us." Caleb's gaze bore into him, unblinking and relentless. "Protecting who?" he asked. "The ones at the top? The ones who profit from the pain and suffering of others? You call that protection?" Henry shook his head, his tears streaming down his face. "I didn't know," he said again, his voice barely audible. Caleb's expression darkened, and the shadows around him seemed to pulse with a life of their own. "You didn't want to know," he said, "because knowing would have forced you to change. And you were too afraid to change." Henry's chest heaved, his mind racing as he tried to process Caleb's words. The flickering lights cast distorted shadows across the walls, their movements erratic and unsettling. He felt like the walls were closing in, the weight of Caleb's accusations pressing down on him like an invisible force. "What do I do?" Henry whispered, his voice trembling. "How do I fix this?" Caleb stepped closer, his pale face inches from Henry's. "You can't fix what's already broken," he said. "But you can stop it from getting worse. You still have a choice." "But the clock is ticking." The hum grew louder, and the shadows seemed to close in around them, their dark tendrils curling toward Henry like grasping hands. He clutched at his chest, his breath coming in short gasps as he stared into Caleb's hollow eyes. "What choice?" he asked, his voice cracking. "What do you want me to do?" Caleb's gaze didn't waver, his expression as cold and unyielding as ever. "Open your eyes," he said. "See the world for what it really is. And when the time comes, make the right choice." The lights flickered one last time before going out completely, plunging the room into darkness. The hum ceased, leaving a suffocating silence in its wake. Henry sat frozen, his chest heaving as he tried to process what had just happened. The shadows on the walls stilled, and the room felt empty once more. But Caleb's words echoed in Henry's mind, relentless and haunting. "Open your eyes. See the world for what it really is." The silence that followed was suffocating, heavier than any Henry had ever known. He remained on the floor, his knees pressed against the cold wooden boards, his breath shallow and labored. The shadows on the walls had stilled, but the room felt no less oppressive. Caleb's words echoed in his mind. "See the world for what it really is." Henry's head throbbed as he tried to make sense of everything. Was this a warning? A punishment? Was he truly at fault for what Caleb had described? He clenched his fists, his knuckles whitening, as doubt and guilt began to intertwine, suffocating him from within. His gaze shifted to the photograph on the mantel once again. Caleb's smile stared back at him, bright, full of life, full of hope. It was the same expression Caleb had worn before the arguments began, before their relationship had fractured under the weight of differing beliefs. Henry reached out toward the photo, his fingers trembling, but stopped short when a sound broke the silence. It was faint, barely audible at first, a rhythmic tapping, like fingers drumming against a window pane. Henry froze, his pulse quickening. The tapping grew louder, more insistent, echoing through the empty house. He scanned the room, his heart pounding in his chest. "Caleb," he called out, his voice trembling. The tapping stopped abruptly, replaced by a low creak that came from the direction of the front door. Henry's breath hitched as he turned to face it. The doorknob rattled slightly as though someone or something was testing it. The air in the room grew colder, and a faint, familiar hum began to resonate, sending a shiver down Henry's spine. He stood shakily, his legs unsteady beneath him. His hand gripped the back of the couch for support as he stared at the door. "Who's there?" he demanded, though his voice lacked the authority it once carried. The doorknob stilled, and for a moment, the house fell silent once more. But then, slowly, the door began to creak open, its hinges groaning under the strain. A cold wind swept into the room, extinguishing what little warmth remained. Henry took a step back, his heart racing as the door swung fully open, revealing the darkness beyond. A figure stood in the doorway, its form obscured by the shadows. Henry's breath caught in his throat as the figure stepped forward, its movements slow and deliberate. When it came into the faint light of the living room, Henry's stomach churned. It was Caleb, but something was different this time. His face was gaunt, his eyes darker and more hollow than before, and his expression carried a weight of sorrow and anger that made Henry's chest tighten. His movements were stiff, almost mechanical, as he stepped fully into the room. "You don't have much time," Caleb said, his voice low and steady. "It's happening, Dad. And you're still not listening." Henry stumbled back, his mind racing. "What's happening?" he demanded, his voice breaking. "What are you talking about?" Caleb's gaze bore into him, unblinking and cold. "The world is unraveling," he said. "Greed, hate, division, they're tearing everything apart. And the people you've trusted, the ones you've defended, they're letting it happen." Henry's stomach twisted as memories of past arguments with Caleb flooded his mind. He thought about the countless times he had dismissed his son's concerns, the way he had defended leaders and policies Caleb had condemned. "You're wrong," he said weakly. "I didn't know." "You didn't want to know," Caleb interrupted, his voice sharper now. "Because knowing would have forced you to change. And you were too proud to admit you were wrong." Henry shook his head, his fists clenching at his sides. "I did what I thought was best," he said. "I believed in people who could make this country stronger." Caleb tilted his head slightly, his dark eyes narrowing. "Stronger for who?" he asked. "For the ones who already have everything? For the ones who profit while the rest of us suffer?" Henry's breath quickened, his chest tightening as guilt and anger warred within him. "It wasn't supposed to be like this," he said, his voice trembling. I thought things would get better." "They didn't," Caleb said simply. "And now we're running out of time." The lights flickered violently, casting distorted shadows across the walls. Caleb stepped closer, his presence more overwhelming than before. "You still have a choice," he said. "But it won't matter if you don't act. The longer you wait, the worse it gets." Henry's knees threatened to buckle, but he forced himself to stand firm. "What do you want me to do?" he asked, his voice desperate. "Tell me how to fix this." Caleb's gaze softened slightly, though the weight of his words remained. "Open your eyes," he said. "See the truth. Stop hiding behind excuses. The world can still be saved, but not if you stay on this path." The shadows on the walls seemed to ripple, the darkness growing deeper and more oppressive. Henry felt his breath hitch as Caleb's figure began to blur, his edges dissolving into the shadows. "Wait," Henry shouted, his voice cracking. "Don't leave me. Tell me what to do." Caleb's voice echoed through the room, soft but unrelenting. "You already know," he said. "The choice is yours, Dad. But the clock is ticking." The lights flickered one last time before going out completely, plunging the house into darkness. The hum ceased, leaving Henry alone in the suffocating silence. His knees gave out and he sank to the floor, his hands trembling as he clutched at the edge of the coffee table. The shadows around him seemed to watch, their presence lingering even as Caleb's voice faded into nothingness. Henry's mind raced, his chest heaving as the full weight of his son's warning settled over him. He clenched his fists, trying to steady his breathing. He wanted to dismiss it all as a nightmare, a cruel trick of his grief-stricken mind. But the evidence of the past few hours, or had it been minutes, was all too real. The flickering lights, the shadows that moved on their own, the unbearable cold that cut through him like a blade. And Caleb, his son, or whatever this manifestation was, had spoken with a clarity and weight that left no room for doubt. His gaze shifted to the photograph on the mantel. Caleb's smiling face stared back at him, frozen in time, a sharp contrast to the pale, hollow-eyed figure that had stood before him moments ago. The boy in the photograph was full of life, full of dreams, and yet Henry had ignored so many of them, dismissing his son's warnings as the ramblings of an idealistic teenager. Now, Henry couldn't shake the feeling that Caleb had been right all along. A rhythmic tapping sound broke the silence, faint at first but growing louder. Henry froze, his pulse quickening as he scanned the room. The tapping stopped abruptly, replaced by a low creak at the front door. Henry's breath hitched, his chest tightening. "Who's there?" he called out, his voice trembling. The doorknob rattled slightly as though someone or something was testing it. The air in the room grew colder, and a faint, familiar hum began to resonate, sending a shiver down Henry's spine. He stood shakily, his legs unsteady. His hand gripped the back of the couch for support as he stared at the door. "Caleb?" he asked weakly, though dread clawed at his chest. The doorknob stilled, and for a moment, silence enveloped the house. Then, slowly, the door creaked open, its hinges groaning. A cold wind swept in, extinguishing what little warmth remained. Henry's breath came in shallow gasps as a figure stepped into the room. It was Caleb, but something was different. His face was gaunt, his eyes darker, and his presence radiated a chilling energy. He stepped forward, his movements stiff and deliberate. "You don't have much time," Caleb said, his voice low and steady. "It's happening, Dad. And you're still not listening." Henry stumbled back, his mind racing. "What's happening?" he asked, his voice breaking. "What do you mean?" Caleb's dark gaze bore into him. "The world is unraveling," he said. "Greed, hate, division, they're tearing everything apart. And the people you've trusted, the ones you've defended, they're letting it happen." Henry's stomach twisted. "You're wrong," he said weakly. "I didn't know." "You didn't want to know," Caleb interrupted, his voice sharper now. "Because knowing would have forced you to change. And you were too proud to admit you were wrong." Henry clenched his fists, anger flaring amid his fear. "I did what I thought was best," he said. "I believed in people who could make this country stronger." Caleb tilted his head slightly, his dark eyes narrowing. "Stronger for who?" he asked. "For the ones who already have everything? For the ones who profit while the rest of us suffer?" Henry's breath quickened, his chest tightening as guilt and anger warred within him. "It wasn't supposed to be like this," he said, his voice trembling. "They didn't," Caleb said simply. "And now we're running out of time." The lights flickered violently, casting distorted shadows across the walls. Caleb stepped closer, his presence more overwhelming than before. "You still have a choice," he said. "But it won't matter if you don't act." Henry's knees threatened to buckle, but he forced himself to stand firm. "What do you want me to do?" he asked, his voice desperate. "You start by opening your eyes," Caleb said. "Stop hiding behind your beliefs. See the world for what it really is." Henry looked up at his son, tears streaming down his face. "And then what?" he asked. "How do I change anything?" "You start small," Caleb said. "You listen. You learn. You stand up for the people who need you. And when the time comes, you choose what's right. Not what's easy." The shadows around Caleb began to dissolve, his form becoming less distinct. Henry reached out instinctively, his heart aching. "Caleb, wait," he called. "Don't leave me." Caleb's gaze softened, and for the first time, a faint smile crossed his face. "I'm not leaving," he said. "I'll always be with you. But you have to do this on your own." The lights flickered one last time before going out completely, plunging the room into darkness. The hum ceased, leaving Henry alone. He sank to the floor, his chest heaving as Caleb's words echoed. "See the world for what it really is." Henry's gaze fell on Caleb's photograph. He clutched it close, tears falling freely. "I'll make it right," he whispered. "I promise." The shadows stilled, and for the first time, the house felt quiet, truly quiet. The cold air lifted, replaced by the faintest warmth, as Henry resolved to begin again.